I'm going to begin.
All right, go ahead, Gail.
Thank you for joining today's Halloran Consulting Group Town Hall, Psychedelics as Therapeutics, Unique Considerations for Clinical Trials. Halloran has over 100 consultants whose subject matter expertise in strategy and program leadership, clinical operations and study design, regulatory support, execution and submission, and organizational design and transformation, as well as building cultures of quality, have helped over 3,000 clients in the pharma, biotech, and med device sectors for 25 years. We are celebrating 25 years this year. A reminder about what you'll hear today. The 21st century has seen a renewed interest in the potential benefits of psychedelics as therapeutics. This renaissance is driven in part by clinical trials indicating that psychedelic-derived drugs may address an unmet need in a range of disorders, especially neuropsychiatric disorders. As these therapies generate more interest from investors and drug development organizations, we must consider the unique challenges that developing these therapies pose. These challenges include site selection, patient safety, and the interplay between psychedelic and psychotherapy treatments. In today's town hall, moderated by Yolanda Hayden, Halloran Consulting Group's program manager, you'll hear from a clinically focused panel of experts within the psychedelics as therapy ecosystem. Just a few small housekeeping items before we begin. If you're not already on mute, please do so. We are leaving room at the end of the call for questions and answers. However, please feel free to use the chat feature and we'll monitor these and include these questions at the end of the forum. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be posted to our Halloran website. Yolanda, I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Gail. And I'm going to move this along as quickly as I can because we want to get into the meat of the discussion. So I will ask each of you panelists to introduce yourself. Dr. Shaman Ghaznavi, perhaps you'd take a moment, please.
Hi, I'm the Associate Director and the Director of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Massachusetts General Hospital. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Christine Moore.
Yeah, hi everyone. I am a member of the Scientific Solutions team at Worldwide Clinical Trials, which is a mid-sized CRO, and we are quite active in the psychedelic space. So thanks for having me on today.
We appreciate you joining us. And then I'm going to try not to butcher this too badly.
Allison's fine. Yep.
Yeah, good. Allison will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Gasevich. I am the Senior Vice President of Clinical Operations here at Cybin, and we are a small biotech that's currently conducting trials within the psychedelic space. So thank you, everyone, for having us today.
Wonderful. So as you can tell, we have a representative from each of the researcher investigator grouping, the CRO working in clinical trials, and a sponsor. So our questions are going to be able to be addressed by all of them, I hope. Let's pitch right in. Ladies, what are the greatest challenges in identifying suitable sites for clinical trials using psychedelics? Allison, perhaps you'd like to get us started.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We are currently embarking upon our initial first-in-human studies and moving swiftly into our proof of concept trials. And I spent many years working on the CRO side and now have evolved to the sponsor side. And it's interesting to see because within the psychedelic space, the number of sites available to conduct this type of research is not nearly as pronounced as what you see in other types of drug therapies. The challenges are, access to, of course, to patient populations, which you see in many psychiatric studies can be, the market is somewhat overwhelmed with these types of trials. But beyond this is really just the type of site that you're working at that are skilled in the conduct of psychedelic studies. There are certain room and setting requirements that may pose some obstacles to sites. Also, the access to appropriate psychotherapists and staff. So it's a very different model than what you see in traditional drug development.
That's interesting. Now, Christine, you're obviously well involved in this site identification. What's your experience at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So Allison is exactly right. It's a different kind of site. The good news is that the site network that is capable of doing these complicated trials is growing. So the work started in academia, which laid a really good foundation, but now we're seeing industry professional sites come on board. And what we look for is, as Allison said, experience with the patient population, ideally also experience in doing regulatory controlled clinical trials, which we can help with if that piece is missing, but it's certainly an advantage if the site has that experience. And as Allison mentioned, the needed staff and access to the patient population.
Great. Shaman, you're obviously on the other side of the coin. People are seeking you out to conduct clinical trials, but what are you seeing as far as clinical trial site selection is concerned?
Well, I think given that these are Schedule I substances, that presents unique challenges of figuring out storage and dispensing the drug, and as Allison mentioned, the room and the setting is important. So our usual sterile clinical rooms aren't going to do a great job. So we had to sort of set up a room that would be good for psychedelic trials, and we had to also think about where things would be stored, setting all of that up with the DEA, because most of us are pretty new players on the field. Even though there's been a real resurgence in interest, it's taken time just because of all the regulatory processes to be set up to be able to actually run these trials, both in terms of the aesthetic requirements of setting and so on, but also the regulatory requirements, the DEA requirements, and then, as Allison mentioned, getting up to speed on the therapy that's involved with these sorts of psychedelic trials, which don't always conform to traditional therapies that have been that people are trained in.
Great. You touched on a couple of points that we'd like to return to in a while, on the regulatory interactions and on some of the needs at sites. But just for a moment, we'll sidetrack from that. Christine and I were recently at a psychedelics conference, and somebody related how an investigator came in and said, I have my IRB approval. When can I get my study drug? So they had to take a few steps back and talk to the FDA and the DEA, of course. So there is maybe a group of people in this space who perhaps are not familiar with some of the processes. So Shaman, I would like to start with you. What do you wish sponsors, patients, and CROs knew about a clinical trial in psychedelics?
So the one thing that we've found to be the thing that people are the least knowledgeable about is that each license is specific to a protocol. And so even, so sometimes they'll come to us and they say, well, you have a Schedule I license to do it. And it's like, yeah, but that's only for that specific trial with that compound. So even if we're running a study with psilocybin, that doesn't mean we have a blanket license to use psilocybin for any other indication or for any other trial or protocol. The license is protocol specific. And so it gets faster once you have one because you just expand the license, but it's not a direct entry point. You still have to go through a number of steps before you start another study and protocol, and that includes getting that protocol approved through the FDA, the IRB, and then adding it to the existing Schedule I. And so sometimes folks come to us with the expectation that it'll be, we'll be up and running in like 2 or 3 months, and that for their given protocol, and that just, we wish that were the case, but that's not.
Great. Would you like to just expand a little bit more on what the timeline might look like in comparison to a normal trial startup?
So if the facility already has Schedule I capacity, that's a little bit different. So the DEA will also come and view the site to see where you would store compounds and so on. So in our case, it was the first Schedule I study, and so it took 9 months to almost a year, because it also involved checking out the site, as this would be the first study. But thereafter, it's about 6 months. depending on how fast the FDA process goes.
Thank
for
you.
adding.
Christine, I know you've got some experience in this as well. What are you finding that people don't know and you wish they did know?
I'll start with the sponsor side first and then talk a little bit about the patient side. But Charmin's exactly right. It takes time to set these up. And I would, CROs are in a unique position to be helpful because we see experience across many different clinical trials, and over time we gain experience on what's feasible and what works and what doesn't. But realistic timeframes are important. And I'd also say that participant response is often overwhelming, particularly given the unmet medical need and the interest out there in the public. Sites often get many responses, but only a very small fraction of those patients are potentially eligible. And it's important that we enroll the right patients. But on the patient side of things, I guess something I wish patients would understand is these substances are not for everyone. They can be associated with really challenging experiences. So you really need to know what you're getting into ahead of time. And it's important to have a realistic view of what the experience will look like.
Yeah, I think that's a whole topic on its own. Alison, you could tell us from either side whether it be your experience with naive patients, and there I don't mean in the scientific term, I mean people who don't necessarily know about psychedelic trials, but from the view of patients, or as a sponsor, what do you wish you'd known going into clinical trials in psychedelics?
So starting with the last question that you posed, I think both Charmin and Christine has framed this quite nicely, is that it's imperative that you observe the realistic timelines of the launch of studies. There not only are there delays that can often be attributed to ascertaining the Schedule I licensures, but also in just general site startup. We had a rule of thumb in previous studies where we allowed anywhere from 3 to 4 months for study startup in trials. However, for these types of studies, we look for a much longer runway. Not only are you going through the regulatory approvals, ascertaining Schedule I licensures, but you're also looking to ensure that the site is outfitted correctly with the rooms for the set and setting to lead to an appropriate environment to experience this type of patient journey. Also audio-visual equipment in place, identification of psychotherapists that can support the patients through their journey, and just general orchestration and how we'll operationalize the study. There's a lot of moving parts in these trials. They're very complex. For instance, when patients are screened and eligibility is observed, they'll move into what we call the preparatory phase, where we're identifying therapists to meet with patients ahead of the dose administration. So they'll undergo preparatory phase, and then they'll move into dose administrations, followed by integration phase, and then back to the clinic for just general follow-up activities. So a lot of people involved, a lot of moving parts for scheduling, and we rely heavily on human touch for this, and also look for avenues in which we can leverage technology to be supportive of this. So it's really just overall, when I think one of the greatest lessons learned is how we can operationalize these studies to allow efficiency, but not overstep or make errors along the way. In regard to patients, a lot of people want to get involved in these trials, and we've been working heavily in the healthy volunteer domain initially. Screening of subjects is very important. There are many comorbid conditions that certainly may not play so well with psychedelic compounds. I mean, these are very special products. And we find that some patients we do a much more in-depth screening. We've done efforts such as deploying the SAFER module to support additional screening of patients. We've also created additional tools that help us really drill down into in depth into patients to determine, are there underlying traumas that they may not be aware of, or something that could prevent, an appropriate reaction to these types of compounds.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the little messages we got there was many may apply, few are chosen or are
Correct.
suitable.
Yes.
So Shaman, I know when we were talking about this topic, you'd had some interesting experience. It'd be good if you could share that with us.
Sure. So, we have never seen the kind of response without even advertising for our study for it, for any trial ever. Even now we get 20 to 30 emails a day of people reaching out to participate in a study that will enroll 20 people. And it's been surprising that, we have now gone through probably 1,000 screens and people didn't qualify.
Mm-hmm.
And we are being very rigorous because patient safety comes first, being very thorough with our evaluations. But people who are, that we can rule out very early on, and because of just contraindication and exclusion criteria, because the inclusion exclusion criteria are strict, and that's with patient safety in mind for most of these trials. And I think that is pretty jarring for some people because they think anybody can get into any one of these trials. And they're pretty surprised, especially the further along in the process they go, and it turns out that they don't qualify, like when we check with their treatment team or whatever to verify medical records. So, there is an incredible interest in people's, we thought we had a wait list of 1,500 people before we were approved to begin. And we were pretty shocked at how restrictive the criteria were, and in terms of who was referring themselves and who was being referred to the trials. So I think it'll be interesting to continue to work with clinicians more so for referrals to make sure that they're a good fit versus who's referring themselves for trials. There's no lack of interest, but again, not a lot of those people are going to qualify.
So I see that Jason Bain from Science 37 has kind of touched on this and asked, what's the biggest reason for patients not moving forward? It sounds as though one of those reasons is safety, patient safety. But we want to just talk a little bit more about inclusion and exclusion criteria. This one I found a bit personal. I was looking at a trial that was going to be going on down at Mass General in Boston. Sort of put in and looked at the criteria, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. Turned out I'm too old and I'm too left-handed. So perhaps we could touch on that. Shaman, I'm going to actually come right back to you on this to start with, because
it's my trial.
Yes.
So, we are operating under the IND of the company who has the compound, and that IND sets the age limits, and so that that's based on who they have safety data in. And so the upper age limit is 55, and it's been very interesting because we've had a lot of outreach from folks in their 60s and 70s, some who had sort of seen the first wave of psychedelics research and very much wanted to try, and unfortunately we can't include them. The right-handed requirement is more because of the neuroimaging that we'll be doing. So sometimes it isn't about the clinical requirements, it's about the scientific necessary requirements. So it turns out language is, if you're right-handed, language is reliably localized on the left side. But if you're left-handed, it's up in the air and we don't know. And so when we're doing studies that involve presenting written material or asking you to respond to written material in the scanner, we have to limit it to people who are right-handed. And that's pretty traditional for neuroimaging research studies. So that it's the confluence of both the clinical inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as what we need for the mechanistic understanding, the mechanistic research that we're doing.
Thank you. Alison, what's your experience in this area? And I'm looking as well at some of these questions as they can sort of relate to what the topic we're talking about right now. Matt Helbig has asked, are there any pre-screening steps a site can utilize to reduce the number of screen fails?
We actually, that's a great question. We've actually implemented a very large funnel where we start with, if I believe we have several different web pages in which people can log in that are showing interest in psychedelic studies, and they'll complete questionnaires at that time. That allows us to initially identify who could potentially be appropriate candidate as we move through. So much of it is done via technology. Then once they meet 2 clinics, we conduct an initial phone screen. During that period, it allows us to kind of further identify, the patient's qualifications based upon medical history, and also what types of medications they're currently taking. In our trials, we do allow SSRIs and SNRIs, but they must be on stable doses, which is a bit unique to the psychedelic space. So what we're finding, though, that there are many other contraindications and medications that we see. So that tends to be one of the top reasons for screen failure. So we're able to identify these based on and also discuss their diagnosis to see if they meet the true criteria for the indication we're researching. Then we actually bring them into the clinics for their initial pre-screening. And once they've signed consent, they meet with the clinician, the psychiatrist, to ensure that they meet both the clinical evaluation and the psychiatric evaluation prior to moving into the study. So I think having this large filter before signing the consent really helps us drill down and not, waste patient time and clinic time for individuals coming in.
Christine, I'm sure you have some thoughts you could add to this. Give us what
Yeah, I mean, I don't want potential patients out there to be too disheartened. I mean, many of these trials are in early stages. We're in phase 2 trials with just a few exceptions. And the purpose of doing those trials is to really have a good idea at the end of the trial if the product is safe and the product shows enough of an efficacy signal to proceed. So we are intentionally restrictive in these earlier clinical trials so we can answer those questions definitively. And psychiatric trials in general are really complex. And when you add the psychedelic component, it becomes even more complex. So we have to do things like be very careful with rating potential symptom improvement. So the therapists or facilitators and the ones rating the efficacy scales really shouldn't talk to each other. They need to be independent of one another. So we're doing things the best we can to not expose patients unnecessarily, but we're moving along to broader phase 3 trials. And when that happens, the purpose in a larger study is to be more generalizable for the patient population. So, I guess my message to potential participants is to just be patient, and we should have more opportunities as time goes on.
Good. So the potential patients should be patient.
Yes.
So many members of our audience are familiar with the interactions with the FDA, but this is a slightly different kettle of fish. So what is it like working with the DEA as well? How does this complicate logistics and timelines, not just with clinical trial startup, but across the clinical trial itself? Christine, let's go back to you immediately.
Sharman did a good job at describing some of this already. So you do need a Schedule I license. And often, the process is pretty well defined. And often, at least, in the US, working with the DEA specifically, there are regional DEA agents that can be helpful in navigating the process. You do need not only an IRB approval, but the application itself requires an IND number. So the IND has to be filed. The final protocol needs to be IRB approved. If you've never gotten a license before, you get the inspection, as Sharman was mentioning, with careful attention to things like drug storage and movement of drug around the facility. And that license is generally valid for 2 years, but has to be amended if the protocol gets substantially updated or amended itself. And then again, it's protocol specific. So if another study comes along, you need to reapply specific to that study. You may not need an inspection again, but you will need to reapply. And sometimes there's also a state specific review in addition to the DEA process. That is not in every state, but some states have their own process as well.
So clearly from that point of view, it's not fully standardized, but yes, reaching out to your local DEA office is apparently a good place to start. We did learn recently that many of them will collaborate with you, closely partner with you to facilitate the process. But how about things like record keeping? Shaman, you probably have to see this up close and personal. What extra complications does working with the DEA add to that?
So there are extra medication logs and so on associated with the Schedule I substance. In our case, we transport it from one building to another, which adds the complication of, because that's not allowed by federal standards, but we needed to do it to get it from our clinical research trials pharmacy over to the imaging center, because we're imaging the day of administration as well. And so, there's added records of possession, and also taking it back if for some reason it wasn't used or it needed to be, there's extra documentation around that, but otherwise the regulatory documentation is pretty similar to other clinical trials in terms of, who's excluded, why, what you're doing to keep track of things. The main complication is possession of the drug at an extra level of security and checks and balances.
Yes, I guess I know when everybody jokes about giving out free samples at a conference, for instance, but that's not a thing. I do want to assure those of you who have got questions coming up in the meeting chat, I'm not ignoring those. I'm pulling in questions as they relate to the conversation. We'll get to as many of those at the end as we can as well. Endpoints. Endpoints in studies of many drugs are very objective, biomarkers, whatever else it may be. But of course, in a study of psychedelics, psychedelic-assisted therapy, many of those endpoints are necessarily subjective. So are there any objective endpoints and metrics on the horizon? Alison, let's see what you can tell us.
Well, I think in the psychedelic space, many of the indications that we're looking towards are related to psychiatry, in which most of these endpoints are subjective, as we know. There is some interest in looking towards biomarkers. I don't think we're quite there yet. So it's rapidly evolving, though. So we're hopeful that we will see some of these changes in the future. But as it stands now, it's predominantly a subjective measure that we're looking towards for endpoints.
Shaman, what kinds of things are you seeing that you're using in the clinic or that sponsors are suggesting?
Well, as Alison said, in psychiatry, it really is self-report measures and clinician-rated measures, so it's subjective. We are working towards biomarkers, but the field isn't there yet with clear biomarkers that we can follow. So we have to work with what we have, that's mostly self-report measures and clinician-rated measures, which are subjective. But maybe down the road, when the field itself has biomarkers, we'll have biomarkers to look at in psychedelics as well.
And Christine, on a broader scale across companies, what are you seeing?
Well, it's the same as Ali and Sharman have mentioned. I don't think we'll ever get away from subjective endpoints in psychiatry, because it's really important to hear from patients themselves how they're feeling. I think in the future, we may look for more objective endpoints as a supplement to patient-reported outcomes or clinician-rated outcomes, but those will always be important in psychiatry.
And we've just had a question coming from Amy, which is related to this. What about the FDA? How are they reacting to these more subjective endpoints? Are they putting out any advice, any guidance? Are they rejecting certain endpoints? What are we seeing? Again, I'll come back to you, Christine, see if you've got some comments on this.
We're not seeing a whole lot different from psychiatry in general. I mean, the difference in psychedelics is perhaps the treatment model that they come with sometimes it's meant to be an assistive part of psychotherapy, which the FDA does not regulate. But we have gold standard measures in depression, for example. It might be the MADRS or the HAM-D. We have gold standards in PTSD, and that's true in psychiatry in general. And the psychedelic space has adopted those endpoints that we've always used. So, I guess, you could say FDA is supportive, but they have been clear for decades now what kind of endpoints they expect in psychiatry.
Charmin, what could you add to that?
Not much. I mean, they're the measures that have been used for a long time, and I mean, and we know that they have clinical relevance. So that as Christine pointed out, that the subjective measures are really not going to go away because they're helpful to us as clinicians, and ultimately this is about patients and their experience and feeling better. And as long as we can do that with the measures that we have, we'll continue to use them.
So we've sort of dived into this question a little bit already, but trials in this space commonly include a combination of drug therapy and psychotherapy. So can we separate the effects of these two therapeutic paradigms? Alison, what do you think?
I think at this point, it's a great question that you ask because we are drug development companies. So we're very focused heavily on the compounds themselves. But as a companion, psychotherapy is very important, as both Christine and Charmin have noted. We are not doing any head-to-head studies at this time where we're looking, at psychotherapy alone versus drug alone. They are combined. And there is a massive placebo response that we see in patients who are not given acting compounds, who are with standalone psychotherapy, that are showing some improvement. However, the improvement in patients who are given active compounds combined with psychotherapy are substantive. We're seeing some pretty amazing results from these compounds to date. I think you've seen some of the recently published data, but at this time, it's somewhat of a symbiotic relationship that we're seeing. And as Christine noted previously, the FDA and other agencies do not regulate psychotherapy, but they do require certain qualifications of individuals who are performing the role of psychotherapy on the trials.
It's absolutely intriguing. Christine, have you got anything to expand on that?
I think your question, Yolanda, is the $1 million question.
Right.
Can you separate or disentangle the effects of the drug and psychotherapy? We don't know. And it's very difficult to disentangle those two things. So I think if you fast forward a few years, the concern is that if these drugs work, whether it's in a psychotherapy model or not, we want those treatments to be accessible to as many patients as possible that need them. And when you have a psychotherapy model, the concern has been that it will be prohibitively expensive. So there's two sides to the coin, I think, where some drug developers are moving away a little bit from a psychotherapy model and having more like supervised or facilitated dosing. But then there are others who say, no, these are serious compounds with serious potential effects, and to not have psychotherapy integrated with it, there may be an ethical concern there. So patients often need help integrating these kind of experiences into their lives. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, but I don't think we fully understand the effect of either by themselves.
Charmin, what's your thinking on this? I was very struck when we discussed this much earlier, and you mentioned therapy isn't just a decoration.
Yeah, so just echoing what Christine and Alison said, that we don't know because it hasn't been done, and it's an empirical question whether or not the psychotherapy or the can the medication be or compounds be administered without the psychotherapy. That said, I'm very sensitive to what Christine said in terms of whether it would be ethical. So the experiences occasioned by some of these compounds during the dosing are quite difficult and place people in pretty vulnerable situations. And some of the therapy that's involved is really alliance building between the person who's going to be in the room with them or the therapist, as well as some preparation about what to expect, insofar as that's possible to prepare someone to expect, but also how to tolerate the distress. So, if we took all of that away, in some instances, what does that set people up for in terms of experiences? When it comes to the PTSD trials, for instance, some of these patients with PTSD are reliving some of their traumas. So to do that without knowing how to tolerate the distress, not feeling like you're in the presence of people that whom you can trust to maintain your safety and well-being, there are ethical questions related to that. As to how one defines psychotherapy and what the requirements will be, I think will be interesting as well, because yes, the FDA does not regulate it. So how do we maintain patient safety in the presence of these very powerful drugs, powerful experiences, and while keeping access and cost in mind? Because if it's not accessible and it's not doable, then it's not going to help the people we need it to help. That's the other aspect of this is when we think about how these compounds are believed to work mechanistically based on the preclinical studies, that might be a missed opportunity, right? So if there is this increased plasticity or an opening in a critical learning period, that means coupled with psychotherapy, it could be quite catalytic versus just missing this window of opportunity to affect some change as well. So I think we have to remain open to what actually is going on and resulting in the therapeutic benefit, because we don't know that yet. And how can we optimize benefit? And that's not always going to be about cost and access. Sometimes it's going to be about what we couple with these powerful compounds, especially given what we know about what they might be doing in the brain.
Now, there has been some use, not of a classic psychedelic, but we have seen some movement on the use of off-label use of ketamine, people setting up ketamine clinics. We're also seeing ketamine clinics closing. But what would you say are some of the lessons that we've learned from that so far that could be applied to trials and clinical use of psychedelics? Alison, I don't want you to get too bored, so I'll start with you.
I think actually that may be a better question, better directed at Christine. I think she's had some experience in this, so if I could pitch this one over to her, but thank you for that.
I mean, sure. Where do I start with this one? I mean, there is some evidence that ketamine can be helpful for patients with depression, for example. I think what kind of prompted the ketamine clinics was the approval of S-ketamine, and Spravato is the brand name. But my caution is that S-ketamine and ketamine are not the same thing. They're not dosed the same way. We don't really have good clinical trial data on how to dose ketamine for how long, how often, how long the effects may last. So there's a lot we don't know. So I do get a little concerned that we took the approval of S-ketamine and kind of ran with it with some of the ketamine clinics. Not, although I'll qualify that it has been helpful for some patients. I just think we need to be careful.
We've got a couple of people who've raised questions about, are these single dose studies? Are they multiple dose studies? Charmin, what can you tell us?
It completely depends, right? So for some studies have been single dose, right? The largest, the phase 2b study by Compass Pathways was a single dose with psilocybin, but then there are studies that are published that were with 2 doses, like the New England Journal of Medicine article where they did 2 doses of psilocybin. And then, when you think about the MDMA trials, it's actually 3 doses, right? So I think the question of how many doses are necessary remains an open question because it hasn't been looked at specifically. Some trials are using 1, some trials are using 2, some trials are using 3. No one's really looked at comparing 1 dosing to 2 dosing. I know that they're considering looking at 2 doses of MDMA to see if that can be as effective as 3 doses, or if there are aspects that they can optimize to improve the outcomes after 2 doses. But how many doses are necessary for sustained improvement, especially, is very much an open question. Or how many doses are necessary, depending on how treatment resistant someone is, remains an open question.
And I believe from what we're saying that Matt Helbig's most recent question on how long the psychedelic intervention will remain effective, that's still up in the air. People are still studying that. So that's one of the reasons that this group is all in clinical trials, to help answer some of those questions. Colin Mincham, hello Colin. Colin's posed the question, what are the challenges of sourcing these psychedelics, excluding the DEA licensure? Are they easily available to investigators? Alison, let me start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think so, because these are synthetic in most cases that we're working with. So we're not having any troubles to date in our trials. Some people that may be using just the plant-based actual naturally occurring. I know there are quite a few producers of the compound, and from what I've heard, in academic settings and such, perhaps Sean may have some insight on this. Not terribly challenging, but I know within our trials with the synthetic, I think we really have no. I think during COVID there was a large backlog that was created, so some of the production was slowed. But to date, we're really not having a lot of trouble. It's getting fit from one country to another that proves to be more challenging in these timelines.
Yeah, and I'll add there, when you open an IND to study one of these compounds, there's a lot of legwork that has to be done ahead of time, whether you're using a synthetic or a plant-based compound. You have to show good manufacturing practices. You have to show stability of the compound. So there are other hoops to jump through with a natural compound to put it in a clinical trial. It has to be standardized. It has to be tested.
Shannon, how are you finding the accessibility in your clinic?
So I think it's different whether you're a site for a clinical trial, right? Then accessing the compound is no issue because you're working with the company and you're one of their clinical sites. I think that it can be more challenging when you're trying to source it for another investigation. I think most folks have been pretty open to thinking about it, but they're thinking about understandably, they're thinking about regulatory approval and safety and so on. So, your research goals have to be in alignment with what the company is looking to do, sometimes even to provide compound. So it's different than trying to study other psychiatric compounds that are easily accessible. And there aren't as many most of them are in phase 2 trials right now. So when we started out, they weren't even in phase 2. And we needed GMP formulations of compounds in order for our IRB to be okay with us proceeding to administer it to patients. So it's still early for some of the more exploratory research. It has to be in alignment with the company's goals and definitely within their safety profile. And also depending on what they need to source their clinical trials, right? So it's definitely more challenging than running mechanistic studies or other, exploratory studies of other compounds.
Thank you. Alex, you're probably thinking I'm ignoring your many questions and comments in the meeting chat. I'm not. You mentioned that you're pleased that we're finally talking about this, and I think that's a common feeling. However, my question to the panel, are there any stigmas that you find you still have to address with new sites or with subjects, any of the other groups with which you have to interact, and how do you approach this? Let me start with Christine.
I think the opposite. In fact, there's such a demand. There's such reports of promise online and in social media that I think we mentioned that there are many, many more interested participants than we have space or who might qualify for the study. So I don't think there's a stigma with new sites or subjects or participants, but I will be interested in seeing in years to come what that stigma looks like in general practitioners who may not be as informed of the data at first. I think psychiatry is, pretty excited about the possibility, but it may take some more time for general practitioners to digest the data that come out.
Alison, how about you?
So I do agree completely with what Christine has noted. However, we have encountered some challenges from two perspectives. One, there's the notion that we really want to protect the sacred. These are plant-based healings that are used through many indigenous populations. And as we're moving forward to develop them, through the drug development process, protecting the sacred is key. In many domains. So there are some challenges here that we've seen to date, particularly moving from a bit more flexible or in-depth research space of academia into a private sector. You lose this. So this has created one challenge. And another one, I think I saw a question appear a moment ago about our research in veterans. I was quite surprised because when I initially, we are moving forward in efforts to support our veterans. In this case, we're not actively doing trials, but I know this is a certain interest to not only our company, but many companies in the space. And in my initial engagement and conversations, I was quite surprised when I was asked, well, can you remove the term psychedelic from the protocol title? And, as this is evolving rapidly, and I think the stigma is kind of, stepping aside here, but just the thought that this is potentially illicit drug use in a way, or it could be thought of in this manner versus the type of medicinal treatment it is, it can be a bit of a barrier at times.
Yes, I am seeing that more and more people are talking about entheogens, the plastogens. It sounds more scientific rather than just getting high, frankly.
Exactly, tripping.
Yes, and we do have to separate those a little to get some of that acceptability. Shaman, are you seeing anything in the way of stigma that you have to address?
No, it's exactly as Christine said. It's actually quite the opposite. People are quite eager and excited. I do know. So our first trial does involve coming off of all of your psychiatric medications, and that has been a challenge because some clinicians are nervous about recommending that their very sick patient consider an investigational drug that requires them to come off of all of their medications. So that's the main thing that we've seen with with clinicians, but not because it involves the psychedelics, but because of that requirement of the trial. And actually, most clinicians are quite keen on learning more. The reality is when you have really sick patients, there's nothing you leave off the table. You're willing to consider what you need to help them. And patients are more and more informed, whether it's through social media or, the Netflix documentary. We got like 100 emails a day when the Netflix documentary came out. My research assistants were like, we can't handle this. Like, we have to do something. And we had to come up with pipelines. And I think that that's an underestimate, probably 100 calls and emails a day. So I think, people are quite, in fact, the opposite has to be done, where we have to manage expectations and remind people that this is still investigational. There's still a lot that we're figuring out. And we've had, people come to us and say, I'm not depressed, but I hear this is a cure. And there's nothing to suggest that this is a cure and people will never get depressed again. So we're dealing with the exact opposite, where people are so enthusiastic that we have to manage expectations and make them not feel like this is their last resort, and then disappointed if they don't qualify, for instance, for the study.
Yeah, you mentioned something that, the topic of hype versus hope is a discussion all of its own. We certainly don't have time here this afternoon, but I think that is something that's going to be an evolving discussion as we see companies grow, fall away, and patients understand that there are limitations. This is, as you say, not a one size fits all. It's not a panacea for everything. We've got a couple of questions that have come up about some of the details of psychedelic trials, and I'd like to just try and dig into a couple of those. So we had somebody who was asking, I think, Alex, it was you again, about heart monitoring during clinical trials in psychedelics. Sharman, I think that you'd be a very good person to start with this one.
Yeah, so they're actually pretty well tolerated, but most trials now have some blood pressure and heart rate monitoring. And people also do undergo EKGs before and after administration in terms of the heart monitoring.
Anybody, either of you other ladies, got anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on the profile of the drug. I mean, do we expect heart rate increases? Do we expect QTC changes and things like that? So we have done studies where we monitor ECGs and vital signs before and after, and we have done trials where we monitor those things all the way through the dosing session. So the answer is yes, we are including many different kinds of safety measures during the dosing session itself and during the follow-up period.
Alison, do you have anything to add?
So in our trials, because we are conducting first in human studies at this time, and we work specifically in the psilocin space as well as DMT at this time, and we are utilizing Holter devices to assess, a day before, a day ahead of dosing, and then both Holter monitoring and ECG throughout the dosing period and thereafter up to 12 hours. However, I think the specific question was related to heart rate variability.
Yes.
I don't think, we're doing this more for safety measures, more so than looking specifically at variability. We do have very stringent stopping criteria that are set around blood pressure and ECG or cardiac monitoring. However, specific studies in HRV we're not doing at this time, but it is a very interesting topic to consider, I think.
And then just we do have quite a wide ranging audience. You mentioned Holter monitoring. Would you just give a little explanation of what that is? Because I think not everybody's familiar with that.
Yeah, just wear it and it collects data continuously. So pretty simple, just like one of these cool smartwatches.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Yeah. We have a few moments left. Jennifer Rapella says, can you speak to dosing psychedelic naive subjects versus psychedelic experienced subjects? And the as an add-on, would that previous experience help? Alison,
That's a really good question. I can tell you that we set guardrails more so on the number of administrations if you don't want habitual users of psychedelics involved in the trials, even in our healthy volunteer studies, we try to restrict the number of uses over a 10-year period, for instance. I can tell you for our DMT trial, because if you know much about DMT, within 2 minutes, you're up here, and so it's, we really like to look into, we're working in the healthy volunteer space where, and this study is not being conducted in the US, and we do have some type of preparatory engagement with patients to tell them what to expect, but we don't have this traditional psychotherapy model that we're using in patients at this time, and even healthy volunteers on other trials. So within this trial, we are encouraging individuals who have experience in DMT for this particular study. In our psilocin studies, we are not requiring this, but we certainly don't exclude patients, because I think it's kind of like you don't really know what to expect. And in our studies, we're doing multiple administrations. The data from the first administration that you'll see on a mystical experience questionnaire or other subjective questionnaires that are used to assess the drug effect, the patient's perception of drug effect, can be very different from the first administration versus the second administration. I think the patients may become a bit more comfortable with what they're experiencing and realizing, that fear of harm may have subsided a bit, and we're seeing really good results from this.
Good.
Like I was mentioning before, in earlier phase 2 studies, or earlier studies, we're really looking for clear interpretation at the end. Sometimes we have to be careful about what prior psychedelic experience does to expectancy effects.
Mhm.
that can lead to potential bias in reporting of symptoms later. And some would say that when there's an expectancy or bias there, we exaggerate the effect size of the treatment difference at the end of the day. So you may see in earlier trials that we are looking more for psychedelic naive patients, but also, we're having to balance. That's harder and harder to do in the population. So it's a bit of a balancing act of when to include and when to exclude.
I think we have time for one more question. So, Manny, I can address your question offline. David, if we talk about third-party payments or payers, we'll be here until I'm in my pajamas and drinking my hot chocolate. So we will, in fact, though, go to your question, David. What types of adverse effects have been observed to date? Let's start with you, Charmin, because I would imagine you see these up close and personal.
Well, the good news is that in controlled clinical trials, there haven't been very serious adverse effects. I think because the patient population is very well screened and the environment is very controlled. In this wave of psychedelic research, you go back to older trials before IRBs and stuff like that. They had some questionable practices that did have adverse outcomes and bad trips. But the good news is in clinical trials, so thus far, there haven't been many adverse outcomes. Which is very different from if people are using it recreationally or out on their own or sitting with whoever. But in controlled clinical trials with the careful selection, there are very few adverse outcomes.
Well, that's it. We are at time, I'm afraid. I'd love to thank our three panelists, Charmin, Christine, Alison. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights. We'd also like everybody in the audience here today. Thank you for joining us today. Even if we didn't get to your question, we hope we answered some of your questions, or that you learned something new. We covered a lot of ground today, and at the same time, we merely scratched the surface of this brave new world. If you'd like to continue the discussion, particularly around the clinical, regulatory, and program management aspects of a development program in psychedelics, please reach out to the Halloran team. You can learn more about us by checking out our website at hallorancg.com. And rather than repeating it, we're making it easier for you by giving you a QR code. For those of you who did ask questions and we didn't have a lot of time to answer them, we will try and reach out to you and continue that conversation. And again, if you want to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.